she arrived on a bullet-riddled stagecoach, in a ruined silk dress, with a trunk full of chemicals instead of lace. He was a broken rancher with 30 days left before a ruthless banker took everything his father ever bled for. They didn't marry for love. They married for survival. But when the fires came, when the water was poisoned, and when 6 armed men rode into their yard ready to bury them both, this woman didn't run. She built a weapon out of weeds and brought an empire to its knees. The greatest lesson this story teaches us is this: survival is never a solo act, and the right partner doesn't complete you. They ignite you. If that kind of story moves you, hit like, drop a comment telling me what you felt and subscribe, so the next story finds you before life gets too loud.
The Nebraska sun was a merciless anvil, hammering the sprawling plains into a cracked, brittle submission. Silas Vance felt every ounce of that heat as he drove his buckboard wagon into the dusty settlement of Pine Ridge. He was 2 hours late. His knuckles were scraped raw, his muscles burning from the morning's desperate labor. Harlon Cole's men had struck again before dawn, cutting a quarter-mile of barbed wire on the northern boundary of the broken spur. Silas had spent the morning driving posts and twisting wire just to keep his last remaining dozen head of cattle from wandering into the canyons. At 34, Silas felt like a man carrying a collapsing roof on his back. His face was a map of hard years and fresh scars, his gray eyes narrowed against the glaring light. He pulled the wagon to a halt outside the relay station, expecting to find an angry, impatient woman sitting on her trunk. He had sent for a mail-order bride months ago, specifically requesting a sturdy, weather-beaten widow. Someone who knew the brutal arithmetic of frontier survival. Someone who could churn butter, mend a fence, and wouldn't weep when the winter winds howled through the floorboards. Instead, he found chaos. The Concord stagecoach hadn't just arrived. It had barely survived. It sat angled awkwardly in the dirt outside the station, the horses lathered and blowing hard. The heavy wooden chassis was splintered, pockmarked with fresh, jagged bullet holes. Before Silas could even tie off his team, the stagecoach door was kicked open from the inside. Silas tensed, his hand instinctively dropping to the heavy Colt revolver at his hip. But it wasn't a bandit who stepped out. It was a woman in a sapphire blue silk dress. Or, at least, it had once been silk. The hem was caked in a heavy crust of mud and prairie dust, the fabric torn at the knee. She didn't stumble out weeping or swooning as any Boston aristocrat had a right to do after an ambush. Instead, she braced her boots against the wooden step and hauled the stagecoach driver out behind her. The man was groaning, his left arm a crimson mess, blood soaking through his canvas duster. "Help him down!" she barked at the paralyzed station master, her voice lacking any tremor of panic. It was cold, sharp, and commanded absolute obedience. Silas was out of his wagon before he realized he was moving. He caught the driver by the good shoulder, easing the heavy, groaning man into the dirt. "Shot clean through," the driver wheezed, his face pale. "Bandits in the Narrows. She drove the team the last 2 miles." Silas looked up, his gaze locking onto the woman. Clara Montgomery. She didn't look like a widow, and she certainly didn't look sturdy. She was slender, her dark hair slipping from a ruined, complicated updo to frame a face that was strikingly, stubbornly beautiful. But it was her hands that caught his attention. They were covered in the driver's blood, but beneath the crimson, Silas noticed faint, deep-set stains on her fingertips. A yellowish-brown residue, like old tobacco or pine resin. They weren't the soft, pampered hands of a lady. Without a moment's hesitation, Clara reached down, grabbed the delicate lace ribbon trimming her ruined petticoat, and ripped it free with a sharp tear. "Hold his arm still," she ordered Silas. Silas blinked, startled by the sheer authority radiating from a woman half his size, but his hands obeyed. Clara wrapped the lace tightly above the driver's bullet wound. She snatched a splintered piece of oak from the shattered coach door, slipped it under the knot, and twisted it viciously. The driver cried out, but the pulsing flow of bright red blood instantly slowed to a dark, sluggish seep. Keep the pressure there, Clara instructed the station master, standing up and wiping a streak of sweat and blood from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She took a deep, steadying breath, her chest rising and falling against the ruined silk, before turning her dark, intelligent eyes directly onto Silas. "I assume," she said, her tone suddenly clipped and formal, "that you are Silas Vance." Silas slowly stood up, towering over her. He wiped his own dusty hands on his denim trousers. "I am. And you're Clara." "I am." She glanced at the bullet-riddled coach, then at the two heavy leather trunks lashed to the boot. "I trust your wagon has room for my belongings. It has been an exceedingly long morning." The ride back to the broken spur was suffocatingly quiet. The buckboard hit every rut in the hardened earth, jostling Clara on the wooden bench. She sat ramrod straight, staring out at the endless, unforgiving expanse of yellow grass and jagged rock. She hadn't complained once about the heat, the dust, or the blood drying on her dress. Silas kept stealing glances at her from beneath the brim of his Stetson. She was a mystery, and on the frontier, mysteries usually got a man killed or bankrupted. He needed a partner for a working ranch, not a high-society runaway who got lucky with a makeshift tourniquet. "You shouldn't have come," Silas said finally, his voice like grinding gravel. Clara didn't turn her head. "We have a legally binding contract, Mr. Vance. Or do my credentials no longer suit you?" "It ain't about credentials, it's about reality." Silas pulled back slightly on the reins, guiding the horses around a sun-bleached cattle skull. "I don't know what kind of romantic adventure you read about in those East Coast dime novels, but there's nothing out here for a woman like you. Look at your dress. You belong in a parlor, drinking tea out of china." "My dress was a necessity to get past the train conductors without being questioned," Clara replied evenly, though Silas saw her jaw tighten. "And I don't care for tea." "Listen to me, Clara," Silas said, the frustration bleeding into his tone. He owed her the ugly truth. "I'm broke. The plague took 80% of my herd last winter. The local bank is owned by a man named Harlon Cole, and he's doing everything short of shooting me in the back to take my land. My house is a drafty cabin. My fields are choked with weeds, and I've got nothing to offer you but a front-row seat to a foreclosure." He pointed back over his shoulder toward town. "There's a decent boarding house in Pine Ridge. I'll pay for your room for the night. Tomorrow the stage heads back east. You get on it." For a long moment the only sound was the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves and the dry wind whistling through the scrub brush. Then Clara slowly turned to face him. The Nebraska sun illuminated the sharp, aristocratic lines of her face. But there was no fear in her eyes. There was only a cold, hard desperation that mirrored his own. "I can't go back," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, quiet intensity. "There is nothing left for me in Boston but a ruined name, and creditors waiting to pick my father's bones clean." She leaned in slightly, the smell of dust and dried blood clinging to her. Yet beneath it, Silas caught the sharp, clean scent of crushed mint and alcohol. "I didn't cross half the country looking for a mansion, Mr. Vance," Clara said, holding his gaze with an unwavering stare. "I came looking for a place where I can survive. You need someone to help you hold this land. I need the land to hold me. So unless you plan on physically throwing me off this wagon, I suggest you tell me how much water we have left in the barrels." Silas stared at her. The wind whipped a loose strand of dark hair across her cheek. He had expected a fragile porcelain doll. Instead, he had somehow ordered a stick of dynamite wrapped in silk. A slow, humorless breath escaped his lips, and he turned his eyes back to the long dirt road ahead. "There's half a barrel left at the cabin," Silas muttered, flicking the reins. "Hope you ain't afraid of hauling it from the creek." "I am not afraid of anything," Clara replied, turning her gaze back to the horizon. Silas looked at the distant, jagged peaks marking the edge of the broken spur. "You will be," he thought grimly. "When Harlon Cole comes calling, you will be." The wedding took less than 10 minutes. Reverend Miller's church in Pine Ridge was nothing more than a clapboard room that smelled of stale wax and dry rot. There was no music, no congregation, and certainly no celebration. Clara stood before the altar in her ruined, blood-stained sapphire silk, the only dress she hadn't packed away in her heavy trunks. Beside her, Silas Vance stood tall and rigid, his clothes still coated in the pale dust of the plains, his jaw locked tight. When Silas slipped a plain, scuffed silver band onto Clara's finger, his hands were rough and calloused, a stark contrast to her pale, slender fingers. Yet Clara didn't pull away. She met his gaze steadily as they spoke their vows. The words felt less like a romantic promise and more like a desperate, binding treaty signed on the edge of a battlefield. By the time the buckboard finally crested the ridge overlooking the broken spur, the sun was bleeding a bruised purple across the horizon. Silas pulled back on the reins. "This is it," he said, his voice flat. Clara looked down into the valley. The ranch house was a weathered pine cabin that leaned slightly against the relentless prairie wind. A dilapidated barn stood nearby, casting long, lonely shadows over a barren corral. Beyond the buildings, the land rolled out in a sea of dry, yellowed scrub brush, bisected by a thin, winding ribbon of green, where a creek stubbornly clung to life. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress under siege. "It's sturdy," Clara said simply, refusing to let him hear a sliver of disappointment in her voice. Silas let out a harsh breath that might have been a laugh. "You don't have to lie, Clara. I told you it was a hard place." He clicked his tongue, guiding the team down the slope. They had barely reached the front porch, the dust still settling around the wagon wheels, when the heavy, rhythmic thud of approaching hooves echoed across the yard. Silas froze. In a single fluid motion born of pure instinct, he shoved Clara behind him and ripped the Winchester rifle from its scabbard on the wagon. He racked the lever, the metallic clack-clack sharp in the twilight air. 5 riders trotted into the yard, their horses kicking up fresh dirt. The men were heavily armed, their eyes hard beneath the brims of their hats. At their center rode a man in a tailored broadcloth coat that looked entirely out of place in the unforgiving heat. He had a neatly trimmed silver beard and the cold, unblinking eyes of a prairie wolf. "Put the gun down, Silas," the man called out, his voice smooth and dripping with patronizing calm. "I'm just here to pay my respects to the newlyweds." "You're trespassing, Harlon," Silas growled, the Winchester remaining dead level with the man's chest. "And I already fixed the wire your boys cut this morning. You can go straight to hell." Harlon Cole chuckled, shifting in his custom-tooled saddle. He leaned forward, ignoring the rifle entirely, and let his cold gaze slide past Silas to where Clara stood on the porch. "Word travels fast in Pine Ridge," Cole said, tipping his hat with mocking politeness. "They said you sent away for a bride. I expected some plow horse of a widow from Ohio. Instead, you drag a Boston rose into the dirt." Cole's smile thinned into a sneer. "She'll wither in a week, Silas, just like your herd." Clara stepped out from behind Silas's broad back. She smoothed her ruined silk skirt, her chin lifting defiantly. "I assure you, Mr. Cole, I am not as fragile as I look. Nor do I appreciate uninvited guests on my property." Cole's eyes narrowed, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his face before it hardened into pure malice. He turned his attention back to Silas. "The bank's patience is gone, Vance," Cole said, his voice dropping the pretense of politeness. "You're drowning. That creek is the only reliable water for 20 miles, and I need it for my cattle drives. You have exactly 30 days to sign the water rights over to me. Do that, and I'll let you keep the cabin and a few acres to starve on." "I'll die before I sign my father's water over to you," Silas spat. Cole gathered his reins, turning his massive roan horse toward the gate. "That can be arranged, Silas. 30 days. If the deed isn't on my desk, the bank forecloses on the whole spread. And if you try to fight it, well, accidents happen on the prairie every day." With a sharp whistle, Cole and his men spurred their horses, tearing out of the yard and leaving a choking cloud of dust in their wake. Silas stood rigid, his knuckles white around the grip of the Winchester until the riders disappeared over the ridge. Slowly, he lowered the weapon. He didn't look at Clara. The shame of being threatened on his own land in front of his bride of less than 4 hours radiated off him like heat from a stove. "I told you to get on the stagecoach back east," he muttered, his voice hollow. "Now you're in the crosshairs, too." "If I were afraid of bullies, Mr. Vance, I would have surrendered to the ones in Boston," Clara said quietly. "Now, are you going to help me with my trunks? Or do I need to drag them inside myself?" Silas finally looked at her, shaking his head in a mixture of disbelief and weary respect. He hoisted the 2 heavy brass-reinforced leather trunks effortlessly onto his broad shoulders and carried them inside. The cabin was stark and masculine. A cast-iron stove anchored the room, surrounded by a heavy oak table, 2 mismatched chairs, and a single bed tucked into the far corner beneath a quilt of faded wool. "You take the bed," Silas said, setting the trunks down with a heavy thud at the foot of the mattress. "I'll roll out a blanket by the stove." "We are married, Silas," Clara pointed out, removing her dusty hat. "We made a deal to survive, Clara. I ain't forcing myself on a woman who only married me because she had a gun to her back." He gestured to the trunks. "Go ahead and unpack. I'm surprised you got that much velvet and lace all the way out here without the stagecoach breaking an axle." "It isn't lace," Clara said. She knelt before the largest trunk, unfastened the heavy brass latches, and pushed the lid open. Silas stepped closer, expecting to see petticoats and folded linen. Instead, he froze. The trunk was meticulously padded with straw and heavy canvas. Nestled securely within were rows of dark amber glass bottles, gleaming brass scales, a massive cast-iron mortar and pestle, and tightly sealed tin canisters that radiated a sharp, earthy, and pungent aroma. Beneath them sat 3 thick, leather-bound journals, their pages crammed with elegant, frantic handwriting and incredibly detailed sketches of plants, roots, and chemical equations. Silas stared at the makeshift laboratory sitting in the middle of his dusty floor. "What in God's name is all this? Are you some kind of apothecary?" "My father was a botanist and a chemist," Clara said, her fingers gently brushing the spine of the topmost journal. Her voice carried a quiet, fierce pride. "A brilliant one. Before his rivals spread lies to ruin his reputation and strip him of his funding, he taught me everything he knew about the medicinal and chemical properties of flora." Silas ran a hand over his jaw, bewildered. "Clara, that's real fascinating, but science ain't going to pay off Harlon Cole in 30 days. Clara stood up. She walked to the small window, looking out into the moonlit night. The wind was howling over the ridges, bending the tall, coarse brush that grew thick along the banks of Silas's creek. She turned back to him, pointing out the window. "What do you call those low, ugly bushes choking your creek bank? The ones with the jagged leaves?" Silas frowned, looking out. "Yellow root. Damned nuisance. It spreads like wildfire, kills the prairie grass, and the cattle won't even touch it. My father spent years trying to burn it out." Clara's eyes lit up with a sudden blazing intensity. She walked over to Silas's heavy work boots near the door, crouched down, and picked up a dried, snapped piece of root that he had tracked inside earlier. She crushed it between her dirt-stained fingers, bringing it to her nose. A sharp, bitter, distinctly medicinal scent filled the space between them. "It isn't a weed, Silas," Clara breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked up at her new husband. "It's Hydrastis canadensis, golden seal." Silas just stared at her, uncomprehending. Clara stood up, holding the crushed root out to him like it was a nugget of solid gold. "In the mining camps of Colorado and the fever-ridden settlements out west, a pure tincture of this root sells for more than imported whiskey. It stops infections, it heals wounds, it saves lives." She looked back out the window at the miles of worthless scrub brush rolling across the broken spur. "Harlon Cole thinks he's starving you out," Clara said, a dangerous, brilliant smile curving her lips for the first time since she arrived. "But he doesn't realize you're sitting on a fortune." Silas woke to the smell of cold ash and the profound, heavy silence of the prairie dawn. He rolled off the hard floorboards, his back stiff from the thin blanket he'd laid near the stove. He rubbed a hand over his stubbled jaw and glanced toward the corner of the cabin. The bed was neatly made, the quilt pulled tight. Clara was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Silas's chest. Harlon Cole's threat echoed in his ears. Accidents happen on the prairie every day. He grabbed his Colt revolver from the table, didn't bother with his hat, and kicked the cabin door open. The morning air was crisp, the sun just beginning to bleed gold over the eastern ridges. Silas scanned the yard, the barn, the empty corral. Nothing. Then he saw a flash of white canvas moving near the jagged edge of the eastern ravine, a treacherous drop-off locals called the Devil's Cut. Silas broke into a dead sprint, the dry earth crunching beneath his boots. As he closed the distance, his heart lodged firmly in his throat. Clara was dangling over the sheer, rocky edge. She had discarded her ruined silk dress. Instead, she wore one of his old, oversized flannel work shirts, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows, a heavy canvas apron tied tightly around her waist. She was lying flat on her stomach, her upper body entirely over the precipice, reaching down toward a cluster of thick, jagged green leaves growing out of a fissure in the rock. "Clara!" Silas roared. Startled, she shifted her weight. The brittle limestone lip of the ravine crumbled beneath her hips. With a sharp gasp, Clara slid forward, the earth giving way. Silas threw himself into the dirt, sliding the last few feet. He shot his hand out over the void, his calloused fingers locking around her slender wrist just as her boots lost purchase on the edge. The sudden jolt tore at his shoulder socket, but his grip held like iron. Below her, a 50-foot drop gaped like a jagged maw. Clara hung suspended, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She didn't scream. She just looked up at him, her dark eyes wide. "I've got you," Silas grunted, his muscles straining as he braced his boots against a boulder. With a massive heave, he hauled her upward. She scrambled over the lip, and the momentum sent them both tumbling backward into the dry buffalo grass. They lay side by side for a moment, chests heaving, the Nebraska wind whistling over the canyon. Silas pushed himself up onto his elbows, his blood roaring in his ears. The terror instantly transmuted into blistering anger. "Are you out of your mind?" he shouted, his voice cracking like a bullwhip. "It's day 2, Clara. Are you trying to get yourself killed before the ink on the marriage certificate is even dry?" Clara sat up, coughing dust from her lungs. She didn't look chastised. In fact, she looked triumphant. She opened her left hand, which she had kept in a death grip the entire time. Resting in her palm was a thick, gnarled root, bright yellow and weeping a pungent, bitter sap. "The taproot of the Hydrastis canadensis," Clara said, her voice shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but her gaze burning with fierce satisfaction. "The concentration of alkaloids is highest in the roots that fight the hardest for water. The ones growing out of the canyon walls are potent enough to stop a gangrene infection in its tracks." Silas stared at the ugly yellow clump, then at her dirt-smudged face. "You nearly broke your neck for a weed." "It isn't a weed, Silas. It's our survival," she fired back, matching his volume. She scrambled to her knees, thrusting the root toward his chest. "If Harlon Cole gave us 30 days, then we don't have time to sleep. We have to harvest, process, and distill before the stagecoach arrives next week to take our first shipment to the mining camps." Silas ran a trembling hand through his hair, letting out a long, exhausted exhale. He looked at her, really looked at her. Her hair was a tangled mess, her face was smeared with loam, and his oversized shirt swallowed her frame. Yet she looked more formidable than any gunslinger he had ever met. "You can't do this alone," Silas said, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur. "You don't know the land, you don't know the loose rock, you'll die out here." "Then help me," Clara challenged, leaning in. The scent of wild sage and bitter sap radiated from her skin. "I don't have the strength to swing a pickaxe for 10 hours a day, and I can't reach the deepest roots. I need your muscle, Silas, and you need my mind." It was a raw, unfiltered truth. Silas looked down at the root in her hand, the yellow sap staining her pale skin. He thought of his empty bank account, of Cole's sneering face, of his father's grave on the western hill. He stood up, towering over her, and extended a massive scarred hand. "Show me what to dig," he said. By high noon, the Nebraska sun had turned the canyon into a blazing furnace. They worked side by side along the treacherous lip of the Devil's Cut. Silas wielded a heavy iron mattock, driving it into the sun-baked earth to shatter the rock and expose the deep, winding root systems. Clara followed right behind him, kneeling in the dirt, using a small, sharp paring knife to meticulously extract the roots without damaging the precious core. The heat was oppressive, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Silas stripped off his denim shirt, his broad back glistening with sweat. The pale, jagged scars from a long-ago branding iron accident standing out in stark relief against his sun-darkened skin. He paused, leaning on the wooden handle of the mattock to catch his breath. He looked down at his wife. Clara was on her hands and knees, methodically slicing away dead fibers from a massive root cluster. She paused to wipe a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of dark mud across her forehead. Silas's gaze dropped to her hands. Last night, in the dim light of the cabin, he had noticed the stains. But here, beneath the brutal glare of the midday sun, he saw the truth of them. Her knuckles were nicked and scarred. The pads of her fingers were thick with calluses. The deep, yellowish-brown stains weren't dirt. They were the permanent chemical burns of a woman who had spent years handling caustic plant resins and raw compounds. They were the hands of a worker, a survivor. A strange, unfamiliar tightness gripped Silas's chest. The women he knew in town either looked at him with pity for his failing ranch or disdain for his rough edges. Clara didn't look at him with either. She looked at him as an equal. "You're staring, Mr. Vance," Clara murmured without looking up from her work. Silas cleared his throat, feeling a sudden flush of heat that had nothing to do with the sun. "Just making sure you ain't about to pass out. You haven't taken a drink in 2 hours." He unhooked the leather-wrapped canteen from his belt, unscrewed the cap, and crouched down beside her. "I'm fine," Clara said, reaching for another root. As her hand grabbed the jagged stone, a sharp piece of flint sliced cleanly across her palm. She hissed, pulling her hand back. A line of bright red blood welled up instantly, mixing with the yellow sap and dirt. "Damn it," Silas growled, dropping the mattock. He caught her wrist before she could pull away. "Let me see." "It's just a scratch," she protested, though her breath hitched slightly as his large fingers wrapped around her forearm. "Out here, a scratch gets infected, and an infection takes the arm," Silas said sternly. He pulled his red cotton bandana from his back pocket. It was faded and dusty, but it was the cleanest thing they had. He poured a splash of water from the canteen over her palm, washing away the dirt. Clara winced, her fingers curling inward. "Hold still," he murmured, his voice softening unexpectedly. Silas carefully folded the bandana and pressed it against the cut. His hands were massive, rough, calloused, and capable of breaking a wild mustang. Yet, as he bound the cloth around her slender hand, his touch was impossibly gentle. Clara looked up. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his bare chest. She could see the fine lines around his eyes, carved by years of squinting into the wind, and the dark, heavy stubble shadowing his jaw. Silas tied the knot and looked up, expecting her to pull away. She didn't. For a long, breathless moment, the rest of the world fell away. There was no Harlon Cole, no crushing debt, no ticking clock. There was only the heavy, rhythmic thumping of Silas's heart, and the dark, bottomless depth of Clara's eyes looking back at him. The air between them felt suddenly thick, charged with a sudden, startling electricity that made Silas's mouth go dry. He became acutely aware of how softly she was breathing, of the slight parting of her lips. The urge to lean in, to close the scant inches between them and taste the salt and sweat on her skin, hit him like a physical blow. Clara swallowed hard, her gaze dropping briefly to his mouth before fluttering back up to his eyes. A hawk shrieked high above the canyon, shattering the spell. Silas jerked back, clearing his throat harshly and picking up the canteen. He shoved it into her uninjured hand. "Drink," he ordered gruffly, turning his back to grab the mattock. "We still have 10 yards of bank to clear before sundown." Clara took the canteen, her fingers lingering on the leather where his hand had just been. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She took a long, cool drink, her eyes fixed on the powerful slope of his shoulders as he drove the iron pick back into the earth. 10 yards, Clara agreed softly, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. "We had better get to work then." The smell hit Silas a quarter-mile before he saw the carnage. It wasn't the dry, dusty scent of the Nebraska plains, nor the sharp tang of wild sage. It was the cloying, sickly sweet stench of rot, mixed with something sharp and metallic that burned the back of his throat. Silas spurred his gelding into a hard gallop over the northern ridge. When he crested the hill and looked down into the enclosed valley of the north pasture, his blood ran to ice. There, near the large wooden water trough that supplied the enclosed grazing land, lay 3 of his prime steers. Their massive bodies were bloated, legs stiffened in the agony of death, white foam crusted around their swollen muzzles. The rest of the surviving herd, barely a dozen head, were huddled against the far fence line, bellowing in confused, desperate thirst, their instincts warning them away from the water. Silas swung down from his saddle before the horse even stopped moving. He hit the dirt and strode toward the trough, his hand resting on his colt. Floating in the center of the wooden tank was the festering, fly-blown carcass of a coyote. But a dead animal alone wouldn't have killed 3 full-grown steers overnight. Silas knelt, dipping a cautious finger into the water and bringing it near his nose. Beneath the smell of decay was the faint, unmistakable odor of bitter almonds and sulfur. Arsenic. Harlon Cole's men hadn't just tried to scare him. They were systematically dismantling his livelihood, turning his own land into a weapon against him. If the rest of the herd drank, they'd be dead by dusk. If they didn't drink, the blistering summer sun would kill them of thirst before tomorrow. A cold, blinding rage settled over Silas. It wasn't the hot, frantic anger of a desperate man. It was the quiet, lethal focus of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He didn't bother draining the trough. He stood, mounted his horse, and rode back to the cabin at a breakneck pace. When Silas kicked the cabin door open, the heavy pines slammed against the wall with a crack like a gunshot. Clara jumped, dropping the iron pestle she had been using to grind dried roots. She wore her canvas apron, her hands stained yellow with golden seal sap, her dark hair tied back with a piece of twine. The cabin smelled strongly of the earthy, sharp, medicinal compounds she had been distilling for 3 days straight. "Silas?" she asked, her eyes widening as she took in his pale, rigid face. Silas didn't answer. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, heading straight for the gun rack above the bed. He pulled down his Winchester repeating rifle and grabbed 2 heavy boxes of 44 to 40 cartridges, shoving them into his saddlebags. "What happened?" Clara demanded, abandoning her workbench and stepping toward him. "Cole poisoned the North Trough," Silas said, his voice terrifyingly calm as he checked the action on the rifle. The metallic clack-clack seemed to suck the air out of the room. 3 steers are dead. The rest are fenced in and dying of thirst. He thinks he can bleed me out like a stuck pig." He turned, his gray eyes dark and hollow. "I'm riding into Pine Ridge. I'm going to walk into the bank, and I'm going to put a bullet straight through Harlon Cole's heart." Silas moved toward the door, but Clara stepped directly into his path. "Move, Clara," he warned, his voice a low rumble. "You'll hang," she said fiercely, planting her boots on the floorboards, refusing to give an inch. "He owns the sheriff, Silas. You pull a trigger in town, and his deputies will gun you down in the street before the smoke clears. Then the bank takes the ranch anyway." "It's already gone," Silas roared, the agonizing frustration finally breaking through his stoic mask. He threw his hand toward the north. "My cattle are dying. That pasture is entirely fenced, and the creek is miles away. If I try to drive them there in this heat, half of them will drop dead from exhaustion. It's over." "It is not over," Clara snapped, slamming her hands flat against his chest. The impact of her small hands against his broad sternum actually made him stop. He looked down at her. Her eyes were blazing with a ferocious, calculating light that defied the despair in the room. "What exactly did the water smell like?" Clara asked, her voice dropping into the rapid, precise cadence of a scientist analyzing a problem. "Describe it." "Like a dead coyote and bitter almonds," Silas growled, trying to step around her. "It's arsenic, Clara. It's a death sentence." "Arsenic is a heavy metal," Clara said quickly, turning back to her workbench. Her hands flew over her glass vials, her mind moving faster than Silas could track. "If it's a crude mix, it can be separated, bound, neutralized." She grabbed a heavy burlap sack and started tossing things into it. A tin of tannic acid she had extracted from oak galls, a large jar of crushed limestone, and several tightly woven linen cloths. "What are you doing?" Silas asked, his grip tightening on the Winchester. "I am saving your herd," Clara said, throwing the sack over her shoulder and turning to face him. "I need the largest empty wooden barrel you have. I need you to raid the blacksmith forge in the barn for every ounce of cold charcoal you can carry, and I need a bucket of clean sand from the dry wash." Silas stared at her, the rifle heavy in his hand. "Clara, you can't cure a poisoned well with weeds and dirt." "Charcoal is porous. It traps toxins," she fired back, grabbing him by the forearm. Her grip was startlingly strong. "Sand filters particulate matter. Tannic acid creates an insoluble precipitate when it binds with arsenic, rendering it harmless. Now, are you going to ride into town and throw your life away? Or are you going to help your wife filter that water before your cattle die?" Silas looked down at her stained hands gripping his arm, then up at her fierce, unyielding expression. She wasn't just a Boston aristocrat anymore. She was a force of nature. With a tight curse, Silas shoved the Winchester back into its scabbard. "Grab the barrel. I'll get the charcoal." The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the north pasture. The surviving cattle were lowing pitifully, their flanks heaving in the heat, tongues lolling as they pressed against the wooden fence rails. A few yards away, Silas and Clara worked like demons. Silas had knocked the bottom out of an old molasses barrel and propped it up on two flat rocks over a clean, empty water trough he'd dragged from the barn. Sweat poured down his face, cutting tracks through the black soot covering his cheeks as he crushed chunks of forged charcoal with the heel of his boot. Clara was on her knees in the dirt. She layered the bottom of the barrel with the woven linen, then a thick layer of crushed limestone, followed by the clean river sand, and finally, a massive bed of pulverized charcoal. "That's it," Clara called out over the distressed bellowing of the herd. "Bring the tainted water!" Silas grabbed 2 iron buckets, waded into the poisoned trough, and hauled out gallons of the deadly foul-smelling liquid. He lugged the heavy buckets over to Clara's makeshift filtration tower. "Wait," Clara said. She unstoppered a vial of dark, rust-colored liquid, her concentrated oak gall tannin, and poured it into Silas's buckets. Almost immediately, a murky gray sludge began to curdle and separate in the water as the heavy metals bound to the acid. "Pour it slowly," Clara instructed, stepping back. Silas hoisted the heavy bucket and poured the sludge into the top of the barrel. It soaked into the charcoal with a soft hiss. They waited in agonizing silence. A minute passed, then 2. From the bottom of the barrel, a single drop of water fell into the clean trough. Then another. Then a steady, thin stream. Silas crouched down. The water running from the bottom of Clara's filter wasn't gray. It wasn't oily. It was crystal clear. Clara grabbed a tin cup, catching a few inches of the filtered water. She lifted it to the sunlight, inspecting it, then brought it toward her lips to test it. Silas's hand shot out like a rattlesnake strike, clamping around her wrist. "No," he said, his voice rough with terror. "Silas, I need to test if the alkalinity is balanced and if the metallic taste is gone," Clara argued, trying to pull her arm free. "If you miscalculated, it'll kill you," Silas said. His chest was heaving, his gray eyes locked onto hers with a desperate, terrifying intensity. I can buy more cattle. I can't buy another you." Before Clara could stop him, Silas wrenched the tin cup from her grasp and downed the water in a single swallow. "Silas!" Clara screamed, her heart stopping in her chest. Silas stood perfectly still, his eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the burning agony in his throat, waiting for the poison to tear through his stomach. A heavy silence fell over the pasture. Even the cattle seemed to quiet down. Slowly, Silas opened his eyes. He smacked his lips together, tasting the residue. "It tastes like a burnt campfire," Silas rasped, looking down at the empty cup in awe. "And dirt. But no almonds, no sulfur." He looked at Clara. She was trembling, her hands pressed over her mouth, her dark eyes wide with terror. When she realized he wasn't going to collapse, her knees buckled. Silas caught her before she hit the dust. He hauled her up against his broad chest, burying his face in her dark hair. He could feel her heart hammering violently against his ribs. "You crazy, brilliant woman," Silas breathed, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. He pulled back just enough to look at her soot-smudged, tear-streaked face. "You did it. You actually did it." Clara let out a choked laugh, resting her forehead against his collarbone, her soot-stained hands clutching his shirt. "Next time I tell you I know my chemistry, Mr. Vance, I suggest you let me do the tasting." "Not on your life, Mrs. Vance," Silas murmured. They spent the next 3 hours hauling, treating, and filtering bucket after bucket of water under the blistering sun. By mid-afternoon, the clean trough was full. Silas opened the gate, and the surviving herd rushed forward, burying their muzzles in the clear, life-saving water. Silas and Clara sat slumped against the wooden fence, utterly exhausted. They were covered in sweat, ash, and mud. Silas's muscles screamed in protest, but as he looked out at his cattle drinking their fill, a profound sense of victory washed over him. He turned his head to look at his wife. Clara was leaning against the fence rail, her eyes closed, breathing softly. The aristocratic Boston lady was entirely gone, replaced by a fierce, brilliant frontier woman who had just stared down death and won. Silas reached out, his rough thumb gently wiping a smudge of black charcoal from her cheek. Clara opened her eyes, turning her head slightly to lean into his touch. The air between them shifted again, hot and heavy. No longer just the adrenaline of survival, but the deep, undeniable gravity of two people realizing they were stronger together than they ever could be apart. "You didn't just save my cattle today, Clara," Silas said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "You saved my soul." Clara looked at the scarred, exhausted man beside her, a slow, beautiful smile breaking across her face. "We have 20 days left, Silas. We are going to save a lot more than that." The gunshot echoed like a thunderclap, violently shattering the heavy silence of the canyon. Before the sound could even register in Clara's mind, a crate strapped to the bench seat between her and Silas exploded. Shards of thick amber glass and a spray of dark, pungent golden seal tincture erupted outward, soaking the shoulder of Clara's canvas jacket. "Get down!" Silas roared. He didn't wait for her to move. His massive arm swept across her chest, bodily hurling her into the cramped footwell of the buckboard wagon. In the same fluid, brutal motion, Silas drew his Winchester, levered around into the chamber and fired blindly up toward the jagged limestone ridge. The canyon, a narrow, winding bottleneck on the trail to the mining camps of the Black Hills, turned into a chaotic echo chamber of ricocheting lead and screaming horses. Clara crouched in the footwell, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Above her, Silas stood braced on the buckboard, his broad shoulders shielding her entirely as he laid down, covering fire. Through the spokes of the wagon wheel, Clara saw them. 3 riders, their faces obscured by dirty flour sacks with eye holes torn out, spurred their mounts down the rocky incline, cutting off the trail ahead. They weren't trying to rob the wagon. Their guns were aimed straight at the driver's bench. They were trying to slaughter them. "Hold the reins," Silas yelled over his shoulder, kicking the leather straps down to her. "If I fall, you drive this team right over them." Clara grabbed the reins, but she had no intention of fleeing. The lead rider, a hulking man on a massive gray gelding, spurred his horse into a dead charge directly at the wagon, his revolver raised to put a bullet through Silas's chest. Silas swung his rifle to track the man, but the angle was bad, the wagon team thrashing wildly in panic. Clara didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She let go of the reins with one hand, twisting around to grab the small, reinforced wooden box she kept tucked under the bench, the box she had packed separately from the medicines. Her fingers closed around a thin, fragile vial, corked tightly with wax. Inside was a deep red, volatile liquid. It was a vicious, highly concentrated extraction of capsicum peppers and crushed mustard seeds, steeped for weeks in pure grain alcohol. As the lead rider closed within 20 feet, raising his gun, Clara surged upward from the footwell. "Close your eyes, Silas," she shrieked. She hurled the glass vial with every ounce of strength in her shoulder, aiming not for the rider, but for the jagged boulder directly in the path of the charging gray gelding. The glass shattered against the rock with a sharp crack. Instantly, the high-proof alcohol atomized into the dry canyon heat, taking the caustic pepper and mustard oils with it. A fine, invisible cloud of pure, burning agony bloomed directly in the horse's face. The gelding hit the invisible wall of spice and shrieked, a terrifying, almost human sound. Blinded and choking, the massive animal reared back violently, thrashing its head. The rider, caught completely off guard, was launched out of the saddle, hitting the hard-packed dirt with a sickening crunch. The caustic cloud drifted outward. The other two riders pulled up hard, their own mounts sneezing, tossing their heads, and refusing to advance into the burning air. Silas didn't waste the opening. He fired twice. The first bullet took the hat off the second rider. The second shattered the man's collarbone. "Ride!" the third bandit screamed, hauling his terrified horse around. The two remaining attackers scrambled back up the loose scree of the canyon wall, leaving their unconscious companion groaning in the dirt. Silas kept the rifle shouldered until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely into the wind. The canyon fell eerily silent, save for the nervous snorting of their own team and the sharp, spicy tang lingering in the air that made Silas's eyes water. He lowered the Winchester, his chest heaving, and immediately dropped to his knees on the floorboards, his hands gripping Clara's shoulders. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his voice rough and breathless, his gray eyes frantically searching her face, her neck, her arms. He touched the dark stain on her jacket, his fingers trembling. "Clara, are you hit?" "It's tincture," she gasped, her hands coming up to grip his wrists. "It's just tincture. I'm fine." Silas let out a shuddering breath, pulling her against his chest in a crushing embrace. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of sage, sweat, and spilled medicine. For a terrifying second, when that first shot rang out, he had imagined her dead. The thought had nearly torn him apart. "What in God's name did you throw at them?" Silas murmured against her skin, pulling back just enough to look at her in awe. "Chemistry." Clara managed a fierce, shaky smile. "I told you, Silas, I am not defenseless." He looked at the bandit groaning in the dirt, then down at the delicate, brilliant woman in his arms. A slow, dark grin spread across Silas's face. "Remind me never to get on your bad side, Mrs. Vance." The mining camp of Blackwood was a sprawling, muddy scar cut into the side of the mountain. It was loud, dangerous, and reeked of sulfur and unwashed bodies. When Silas pulled the buckboard up to Eli's trading post, the local miners eyed them with suspicious, exhausted stares. Eli, a grizzled man with a missing ear and a ledger book permanently clutched in his hand, stepped out onto the porch. "Ain't buying beef today, Silas," Eli grunted, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Got no grass to feed 'em, and the men want whiskey, not meat." "I didn't bring beef," Silas said, stepping down and offering a hand to Clara. "We brought medicine." Eli raised a skeptical eyebrow at Clara, then at the crates Silas hauled onto the porch. "Medicine? You mean snake oil?" Got a peddler through here last month selling colored water that blinded two of my best diggers." "This is not colored water," Clara stepped forward, prying the lid off the first crate. The sharp, earthy scent of golden seal, willow bark, and echinacea filled the air. "These are concentrated distilled botanicals. Antiseptics for deep cuts, willow bark extracts for fever and joint pain, and preserved fruit to keep the scurvy out of your camps." Eli scoffed. "Lady, my men are half dead from rock dust and pickaxe wounds. A few jars of mashed weeds ain't gonna—" "Eli!" A frantic shout interrupted them. Two miners carried a third man up the wooden steps. His leg was tied tight with a filthy rag, the denim soaked black with blood. "Pickaxe slipped. It's deep and it's already swelling red." Clara didn't hesitate. She pushed past Eli, kneeling beside the injured miner. The wound was ugly, a deep, jagged tear in the calf, the edges hot and angry with the first signs of rapid infection. "Silas, the brown jar," Clara ordered. Silas tossed it to her. Clara uncorked the potent golden seal poultice. "Hold his leg," she told the miners. She poured a generous amount of the thick, bitter-smelling paste directly into the wound, then bound it tightly with a roll of clean, boiled linen she pulled from her satchel. "Give that 20 minutes, Clara told Eli, standing up and wiping her hands on her apron. "The heat will leave the wound, and the bleeding will stop entirely. The root draws out the infection." Eli crossed his arms, waiting. The injured miner gritted his teeth, but slowly the tension began to leave his face. After 15 minutes, he looked down at his leg. "The burning," the miner rasped, looking at Clara with wide eyes. "It's gone cold." The throbbing stopped. Eli stared at the bandage, then looked up at Clara. The skepticism vanished, replaced by the calculating gleam of a merchant who had just struck a new vein of gold. "How much for the crate?" Eli asked. $10 a jar for the tinctures," Clara said smoothly, not batting an eye. $5 for the willow bark. $20 for the large crocks of preserved fruit." Silas nearly choked. The prices were astronomical. Eli didn't even blink. "I'll take everything in the wagon. And I want twice this amount, delivered in a month, so—" An hour later, Silas and Clara sat in the dim, smoky corner of the camp's only tavern. On the scarred wooden table between them sat 2 plates of thick beefsteak, roasted potatoes, and a heavy canvas sack that contained more gold and minted silver than Silas had seen in 3 years. They had done it. They had actually done it. Silas pushed his half-empty plate away and pulled the heavy sack toward him, untying the leather string. The dull gleam of coins caught the low light of the oil lantern. It was enough to pay the bank's interest, enough to buy seeds, enough to survive. He looked up at Clara. She was staring at the money, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up to her, softening the sharp edges of her face. "You saved my life today," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave, cutting through the background noise of the rowdy miners. "In the canyon, that was—" He shook his head, unable to find the words to describe the fierce, terrifying awe he had felt watching her fight. "We are partners, Silas," Clara said softly, her dark eyes rising to meet his. "We protect what is ours." Ours. The word hung in the space between them, heavy and profound. Silas reached across the rough wood of the table. He didn't grab her wrist or her arm this time. He gently laid his large, calloused hand over her slender fingers, feeling the rough scars and the lingering stains of her trade. Clara didn't pull away. She turned her hand over, intertwining her fingers with his. Her skin was warm, her pulse beating a steady, rapid rhythm against his palm. The adrenaline crash was hitting them both, stripping away their defenses and leaving behind a raw, simmering awareness. The tavern was crowded, but to Silas, they were the only 2 people in the world. He traced the line of her knuckles with his thumb, his gaze dropping to her lips. "Clara," he murmured, the name tasting like a promise on his tongue. She leaned forward slightly, the lantern light catching the gold flecks in her dark eyes. "Yes, Silas?" "When we get back to the ranch," Silas said, his voice a gravelly, possessive whisper that sent a shiver straight down her spine. "I'm buying a heavier lock for the door. Because tomorrow, we go to war with Harlon Cole. But tonight—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes promised a fire that had nothing to do with burning barns, and everything to do with the fierce, claiming heat of a man who had finally found something worth dying for. Clara's breath hitched, a flush rising to her cheeks. She tightened her grip on his hand. "Then I suggest," Clara whispered, "we finish our dinner and ride fast." The ride back to the broken spur was wrapped in the vast silver quiet of a Nebraska night. The moon hung low and heavy over the plains, casting long, pale shadows across the sea of buffalo grass. Silas let the exhausted team set their own pace. He sat on the wooden bench with one arm draped casually over the backrest, his fingertips brushing the heavy canvas shoulder of Clara's jacket with every sway of the wagon. The physical contact was slight, but it sent a steady, thrumming heat straight to his core. Beside him, Clara held the heavy sack of gold and silver in her lap. She was quiet, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight, the sharp edges of her Boston upbringing fully worn away by the dust and blood of the day. When they finally pulled into the ranch yard, the familiar silhouette of the cabin felt different to Silas. For the first time since his father had been lowered into the earth, it didn't look like a monument to failure. It looked like a home. Silas hopped down, his boots crunching in the dirt, and moved to unhitch the team. "Go on inside," he told her, his voice a low rumble in the quiet night. "I'll bed the horses down in the lean-to." Clara didn't move toward the cabin. She stood by the front wheel of the wagon, clutching the sack of coins, watching him work with an intensity that made Silas's hands clumsy on the leather buckles. When he finished, he turned and found her still standing there, bathed in the moonlight. He closed the distance between them, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. Silas reached out and gently took the heavy sack of coins from her grasp, tossing it onto the porch without a second glance. The money didn't matter right now. He stepped up onto the bottom step of the porch, putting them at eye level. "You're trembling," Silas murmured, his voice rough as raw silk. "It's the cold," Clara lied, her breath hitching as he reached out. Silas didn't call her on it. He brought his hands up, his large, calloused palms cupping her face. His thumbs gently traced the line of her cheekbones, wiping away a faint smear of soot from the canyon ambush. Her skin was incredibly soft beneath his rough fingertips, but he knew the iron will that lived beneath it. "I thought I lost you today," Silas whispered, the terrifying reality of the ambush finally catching up to him. "When that gun went off—" "I'm right here, Silas," Clara answered fiercely. She reached up, her stained, working hands wrapping around his thick wrists. "I'm not going anywhere." Silas let out a ragged breath, the last of his restraint snapping like dry kindling. He leaned in and captured her lips. The kiss wasn't gentle or polite. It was hungry, desperate, and forged in the adrenaline of survival. Clara met him with equal fire, her hands sliding up his forearms to tangle in the thick, dark hair at the nape of his neck. Silas groaned, pulling her flush against his chest, his arms wrapping around her waist and lifting her onto the porch so he could hold her tighter. She tasted of wild mint, dust, and intoxicating warmth. All the walls they had built, the contract, the debt, the bitter pride, crumbled into dust beneath the Nebraska stars. Silas backed her slowly toward the cabin door, his mouth never leaving hers, his heart hammering a frantic, triumphant rhythm against her breast. Then the wind shifted. Silas froze. He tore his mouth away, his body instantly going rigid. Clara gasped, her eyes fluttering open, confused by the sudden violent halt. "Silas?" He didn't answer. His gray eyes were wide, staring over her shoulder toward the northern edge of the yard. Clara turned. A thick, oily black plume of smoke was blotting out the moon. Beneath it, an angry, unnatural orange glow was rapidly bleeding into the night sky. The storage barn, Silas breathed, the horror dropping his voice to a hollow whisper. It was the secondary barn, the drafty wooden structure where Clara had moved her makeshift laboratory to process the massive harvest of golden seal and willow bark. It was where they kept the drying racks, the seeds, and the tools, and it was fully engulfed in flames. "No," Clara choked out, the word tearing from her throat. Silas bolted. He vaulted over the porch railing, his long legs eating up the distance across the yard. Clara scrambled after him, the heat of the inferno hitting her like a physical blow as they drew closer. Harlon Cole's men hadn't just ambushed them in the canyon. They had sent riders to the ranch while it was undefended. Flames licked up the dry pine siding like hungry serpents, the roof groaning under the intense heat. The crackle and roar of the fire were deafening. Silas grabbed a heavy horse blanket from the fence, dunking it into the nearby water trough. "Silas, stop!" Clara screamed over the roar of the fire, grabbing his arm. "It's too far gone! The roof is going to cave!" Silas turned to her, his face illuminated by the hellish orange light. His eyes were wild, fixed on the burning structure. "Your trunks!" Silas yelled, pointing toward the blazing double doors. "You moved your trunks in there yesterday to clear space in the cabin." Clara's heart stopped. The journals, her father's life work, the chemical formulas, the botanical sketches, the only pieces of her family legacy she had left in the world, they were inside. "Let them burn!" Clara shrieked, her fingers digging into his biceps with terrifying strength. She saw his muscles tense, saw the reckless protective fury in his eyes. "Silas, look at me, I don't care, let it burn!" But Silas Vance was a man who had lost everything he had ever loved to the prairie. He wasn't going to let it take her heart, too. "Stay back!" Silas roared. He threw the soaking, wet, heavy blanket over his head and shoulders, tore out of her grip, and charged straight into the roaring inferno. "Silas!" Clara's scream ripped through the night, raw and agonizing. She lunged forward, but a backdraft of blistering heat physically threw her to her knees in the dirt. She scrambled forward, the smoke stinging her eyes, blinding her. "Silas, come back! Please!" she sobbed, coughing violently as the thick, acrid smoke filled her lungs. Inside the barn, a massive wooden support beam snapped with a sound like cannon fire. A shower of sparks and flaming shingles rained down into the yard. The roof began to sag dramatically in the center. Seconds stretched into agonizing eternity. 10 seconds. 20. "God, no!" Clara wept, pounding her fists into the dirt, preparing to throw herself into the flames after him. Suddenly, a massive, smoldering shape burst through the wall of fire. Silas stumbled out into the yard, collapsing heavily into the dust. The wet blanket had completely singed away, and the back of his flannel shirt was actively on fire. Clara screamed, launching herself at him. She fell to her knees, using her bare hands and her canvas apron to frantically beat out the flames licking up his broad back. Silas was coughing violently, his chest heaving as he gasped for clean air, his face blackened with soot. "You fool! You absolute fool!" Clara sobbed, her hands shaking uncontrollably as the last of the embers died under her palms. The smell of scorched cotton and burned flesh made her gorge rise. Silas groaned, struggling to roll over onto his side. His arms were wrapped tightly around something pressed against his chest. Slowly, his trembling hands opened. He hadn't grabbed the expensive brass scales. He hadn't tried to save the processed roots or the valuable extracts that could have paid off the bank. Clutched to his chest, its edges singed but the thick bindings fully intact, were the 3 leather-bound journals of her father. Silas looked up at her through the soot and the pain, his gray eyes shining with an agonizing, ferocious devotion. He pushed the heavy books toward her trembling hands. "I couldn't," Silas rasped, his voice shredded from the smoke. He winced, a spasm of intense pain crossing his face as the burns on his back flared. "I couldn't let them take the last piece of him from you." Clara stared at the journals, then down at the man who had willingly walked into fire for her. The gold and silver on the porch meant nothing. The burned harvest meant nothing. She threw the books aside and collapsed against his chest, wrapping her arms carefully around his neck, burying her face against his soot-stained shoulder as she wept. Behind them, the roof of the storage barn finally caved in with a thunderous crash, sending a massive plume of sparks spiraling up into the Nebraska sky. They had lost the harvest. But as Silas weakly wrapped his arms around her waist, holding her tight against the blazing heat, Clara knew they had found something Harlon Cole's fire could never destroy. The cabin smelled of scorched flannel, sweat, and the sharp antiseptic bite of raw alcohol. Silas lay face down on the narrow mattress, his massive shoulders corded with tension as Clara carefully, painstakingly cut the charred remains of his shirt away from his back. Every time the heavy fabric pulled at his blistered skin, his jaw clenched so hard the muscles in his neck trembled, but he didn't make a sound. "I need my rifle," Silas ground out, his voice a hoarse rasp. He tried to push himself up on one elbow, his gray eyes blown wide with the lingering adrenaline of the fire. If Cole's men swing back around, I will shoot them myself," Clara snapped, her hands trembling as she forced him firmly back down against the mattress. "Now stay down, Silas. You're going into shock." "I ain't in shock. I've been branded before." "You are not a steer, and this is not a branding iron," she yelled, the sheer terror of the night finally breaking through her composed exterior. Tears cut clean tracks through the thick layer of black soot on her cheeks. "You walked into a collapsing, burning building for books. You could have been crushed. You could have burned to death." Silas went still, his cheek resting against the rough cotton of the pillow. He looked at her, his expression stripping away the hardened cowboy to reveal something entirely raw. "They were all you had left of him," Silas whispered, his chest heaving. "I wasn't going to let the prairie take them too." A ragged sob tore from Clara's throat. She turned away, unable to bear the fierce, absolute devotion in his eyes, and practically ran to the small wooden table where her few surviving supplies sat. Her hands shook violently as she grabbed a heavy ceramic bowl and a jar of pure, unrendered honey she had bartered for in town. She forced her mind into the familiar clinical rhythm of her trade: focus, assess, compound. She mixed the thick honey with a heavy pour of distilled witch hazel and the potent, numbing extract of white willow bark. To this she added the crushed, gelatinous pulp of an aloe plant she kept potted by the window. The chemical reaction created a thick, cooling, antibacterial paste. She returned to the bed, holding the bowl. She took a deep breath, steadying her hands. "This is going to sting," Clara said softly, "and then it is going to go cold. Brace yourself." Silas buried his face in his arms. Clara scooped the heavy salve with her fingers and began to apply it to the angry, blistering burns spanning his shoulder blades and the right side of his back. Silas gave a sharp, involuntary hiss, his muscles bunching beneath her touch. But as the willow bark and aloe took effect, the violent trembling in his frame began to subside. Her touch was incredibly tender. As she worked the medicine into his skin, Clara's tears fell silently, dropping onto the uninjured plains of his back. She finished applying the salve and reached for her last clean white petticoat, tearing the fine linen into long, even strips to bind the wounds. For a long time, the only sounds in the cabin were the howling of the Nebraska wind outside and the rhythmic ticking of the cooling stove. Silas lay in the dark, the pain fading into a dull, throbbing ache. The fever from the trauma was making him lightheaded, stripping away the heavy armor of pride he had worn since his father's death. "He built this place with his bare hands," Silas murmured into the quiet dark. His voice was heavy, weighted with the ghosts of the broken spur. "My father. He fought drought. He fought locusts. He fought the winters that froze the cattle standing up. And he never complained. When he died, he looked at me and told me to hold the line." Clara sat on the floor beside the bed, her knees pulled to her chest, listening. "I tried," Silas choked out, a single frustrated tear slipping into the fabric of the pillow. "God knows I tried, Clara. But the plague hit, and the bank circled, and no matter how hard I worked, the dirt just kept slipping through my fingers. When Cole rode into the yard today, I realized I was going to be the man who lost the Vance legacy. I'm the one who let the fire reach our door. Clara stood up. She moved to the edge of the mattress and gently sat beside him in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. "My father was a genius," Clara said, her voice a soft, haunting melody in the dark. "He discovered things about cellular botany that men in the universities couldn't even comprehend. But he wasn't a politician. When a rival decided he wanted my father's research for himself, he didn't challenge him to a debate. He spread rumors. He accused my father of fraud, of theft, of madness. The whole of Boston high society turned their backs on us in a single season." She reached out, her stained fingers gently brushing the dark, sweat-dampened hair from Silas's forehead. "My father died penniless and broken-hearted, believing his entire life's work was a joke," Clara whispered, her thumb tracing the line of Silas's brow. "I spent the last 2 years feeling completely worthless. A discarded aristocrat with a ruined name and hands stained with chemicals no proper lady would touch." Silas turned his head, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "But today," Clara continued, her voice trembling with a fierce, unwavering strength, "a man walked into a wall of fire just to save a piece of my heart. He didn't care about my ruined name. He didn't care about my stained hands. He looked at me, and he saw someone worth burning for." She leaned down, her lips brushing the uninjured skin of his shoulder. "You haven't lost your legacy, Silas," she breathed against his skin. "Cole can burn the barn. He can poison the water, but he cannot break us. Not unless we let him." Silas let out a ragged breath, the sheer emotional weight of her words settling deep into his chest. He shifted, wincing slightly as he rolled onto his uninjured side, reaching out to capture her hand in his. "Come here," Silas commanded softly. Clara didn't hesitate. She kicked off her boots, climbed onto the narrow mattress, and lay down facing him. Silas pulled her close, careful of his back, tucking her head beneath his chin. Her canvas apron was gone, and beneath her ruined blouse he could feel the frantic, steady beating of her heart. The scent of her, smoke, honey, and wild sage, was the most intoxicating thing he had ever known. "I'm sorry I dragged you into this war, Clara," he murmured into her hair. "I'm not," she answered fiercely. She tilted her head back, her dark eyes blazing with a heat that made the embers in the yard outside seem cold. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the collar of his shirt, and pulled him down to her. This kiss was different. The desperate, frantic adrenaline on the porch had burned away, leaving behind a slow, consuming fire. Silas groaned, shifting his weight over her, his large hands sliding down her sides, pulling her hips flush against his. He was a man starved, and Clara was the only sustenance that could keep him alive. Clara's hands mapped the broad, hard expanse of his chest, tracing the heavy muscles and the pale scars of his past, accepting every broken piece of him. She met his hunger with an intensity that staggered him, her mouth opening to his, inviting him deeper. In the dim light of the cabin, surrounded by the scent of medicine and smoke, the last of their boundaries dissolved. There was no pain, no fear of tomorrow, no Harlon Cole. There was only the slide of skin against skin, the heavy, ragged sound of their breathing, and the desperate, beautiful friction of two survivors claiming each other in the dark. When Silas finally entered her, he moved with agonizing care, his eyes locked on hers, waiting for a sign of hesitation. But Clara arched into him, a soft, breathless gasp escaping her lips, her arms wrapping tightly around his neck to anchor him to her. They moved together in a slow, primal rhythm, forging a bond that went deeper than legal contracts or shared desperation. It was a vow written in sweat, smoke, and profound surrender. Silas poured every ounce of his grief, his hope, and his fierce devotion into her, and Clara took it all, giving him back a fiery, unyielding strength that anchored his very soul. When the release finally crashed over them, Silas buried his face in the crook of her neck, his large body trembling as he held her impossibly close. Clara lay beneath him, her fingers gently stroking his dark hair, listening to the heavy, steady thud of his heart against her chest. Outside, the ashes of their harvest smoldered in the wind. But inside the cabin, holding the man she loved, Clara Montgomery Vance knew exactly what she had to do. Harlon Cole had made a terrible mistake. He thought he was dealing with a desperate cowboy and a fragile bride. He had no idea what kind of storm was coming for him. The 30th day dawned with a suffocating, breathless heat. There was no wind to stir the buffalo grass, no clouds to break the relentless glare of the Nebraska sun. The air itself felt heavy, pressing down on the broken spur like a physical weight. Inside the cabin, the skin across Silas's broad shoulder blades pulled taut, an angry, sensitive lattice of pink healing tissue. Thanks to Clara's meticulous care and her potent willow bark salves, the burns had not infected, but every movement was a raw reminder of the fire. Silas ignored the pain. He sat at the heavy oak table, his face a mask of cold, grim resolve. Click, clack. He pushed a brass 4440 cartridge through the loading gate of his Winchester rifle. He grabbed another from the box, his calloused thumb repeating the motion. He had already cleaned and oiled his Colt revolver, placing it carefully in the worn leather holster hanging from the back of his chair. Clara stood by the cast-iron stove, a steaming cup of chicory coffee in her hands. She watched him, her dark eyes tracking the methodical, deadly precision of his hands. "You're loading for a war," Clara said quietly, the stillness of the cabin amplifying her voice. "Harlon Cole isn't coming to talk, Clara," Silas replied, his tone flat, devoid of the warmth they had shared over the past 3 weeks of recovery. He shoved the last cartridge into the rifle's tube and set the weapon on the table with a heavy thud. "He's coming to take the creek. He'll bring his hired guns, and he'll bring the Pine Ridge sheriff to make the murder look legal." He stood up, grabbing his gun belt and buckling it low on his hips. He wouldn't look at her. If he looked into those deep, dark eyes, the icy resolve he needed to face his own death would melt. "I saddled the bay mare," Silas said, staring at the cabin door. "She's tied up behind the lean-to, out of sight. I packed her saddlebags with the gold from the mining camp and enough water to get you to the next railhead. When they ride into the yard, I'm going to step out onto the porch and draw their fire. You take the back window. Don't look back. Just ride." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Clara set her tin cup on the stove. She didn't weep. She didn't tremble. She walked slowly across the floorboards, stopping directly in front of him. "Take off the gun belt, Silas," she commanded softly. Silas finally looked down at her, his jaw clenching. "Clara, be reasonable. I can't hold off 6 men. I'm a dead man walking, but I can buy you the time to—" "I said, take off the gun belt," Clara interrupted, her voice rising in pitch, a fierce, terrifying fire igniting in her eyes. She slammed her hands flat against his chest, right over his heart. "Do you think I spent 3 weeks pulling you back from the brink of death just to watch you bleed out on our front steps? Do you think I gave myself to you so I could be made a widow by a man who steals water? I have to hold the line," Silas roared, the agony of his impending failure breaking through his stoic shell. He gripped her upper arms, pulling her close. "It's my land, Clara. It's my father's blood in this dirt. I have to fight." "And you will," Clara yelled back, refusing to break his gaze. "But you will not fight them on their terms. You are a rancher, Silas, not a martyr, and I am a chemist." She wrenched out of his grip and spun toward the corner of the room, dragging the heavy wooden table away from the wall. "Clear the center of the room," Clara ordered, her movements suddenly a blur of frantic, calculated energy. "I need the thickest glass jars we have left, the ones from the cellar that didn't burn, and I need the block of beeswax, a pot of boiling water, and every strike anywhere match you have in this house." Silas stared at her, bewildered. "Clara, what are you doing?" "Harlon Cole relies on intimidation and brute force," Clara said, pulling her father's leather-bound journal from beneath the mattress. She flipped it open to a heavily bookmarked page, running her stained finger down a column of complex chemical notations. He thinks he's riding up to a terrified cowboy with a single rifle. He expects a gunfight. She looked up, her dark eyes alight with a brilliant, dangerous alchemy. We are going to give him a storm. Silas didn't argue. He moved. Within minutes, the heavy oak table was covered in thick amber glass jars, a massive iron mortar and pestle, and a block of yellow beeswax melting in a pan over the stove. Clara went to work. The Boston aristocrat vanished entirely, replaced by a master of volatile elements. She took a sharp paring knife and began meticulously scraping the red phosphorus tips off hundreds of matches, letting the highly reactive powder fall onto a sheet of parchment. Silas watched in awe as her hands, scarred, stained, and incredibly steady, moved with surgical precision. Phosphorus is highly volatile, Clara explained, her voice dropping into a focused clinical rhythm. When subjected to extreme friction or impact, it ignites violently. She carefully poured the red powder into the mortar. Next, she uncorked a glass vial saved from her trunks, a dark, heavy jar labeled potassium nitrate, saltpeter. She added a precise measure to the mortar, followed by a handful of pulverized, bone-dry magnesium shavings Silas had filed from an old wagon axle at her direction. Now, Clara said, her eyes narrowing as she reached for a familiar leather pouch. The devil's breath. She upended the pouch. A mound of deep red, finely ground powder spilled out. It was the concentrated extract of capsicum peppers and wild mustard seeds, the same caustic irritant that had blinded the bandit's horse in the canyon, but completely dehydrated into a fine aerosolizing dust. She blended the powders with slow, agonizing care. Even the ambient dust rising from the mortar made Silas's eyes water, and his throat burn from 3 feet away. The impact will ignite the phosphorus and the magnesium, Clara muttered, mostly to herself, using a wooden spoon to carefully pack the lethal mixture into the thick glass jars. The rapid oxidation of the saltpeter will create a massive instantaneous expansion of gas, a flashbang. The explosion will shatter the glass and vaporize the pepper dust into a dense, expanding cloud of caustic smoke. She packed 4 jars tight. Silas brought the melted beeswax from the stove. Clara poured the hot wax over the tops of the jars, sealing them completely against the humid, oppressive air, embedding a thick leather strap into the wax of each jar to serve as a throwing handle. When she was finished, 4 heavy amber spheres sat on the table. They looked like innocent preserves. They were, in fact, devastating chemical grenades. Clara wiped her brow with the back of her forearm, leaving a streak of red dust across her pale skin. She was breathing hard, the adrenaline of the dangerous compounding taking its toll. Silas stepped up behind her. He didn't say a word. He just wrapped his large arms around her waist, pulling her back gently against his chest, burying his face in her dark hair. He kissed the crown of her head, a silent, profound gesture of absolute faith. "You are the most terrifying creature God ever put on this prairie," Silas whispered, his voice thick with reverence. Clara leaned back into his solid warmth, resting her hands over his. "Let's hope Harlon Cole agrees with you." The sudden, sharp cry of a red-tailed hawk pierced the heavy silence of the cabin. Silas lifted his head, his body instantly going rigid. The sound hadn't come from above. It had come from the ridge. It was the warning cry of the local birds being flushed from the brush by approaching riders. Silas gently untangled himself from Clara and stepped to the front window. He pulled the edge of the burlap curtain back just a fraction of an inch. A mile out, cresting the eastern ridge, a thick, suffocating cloud of dust was rising into the pale blue sky. Within the dust, the dark silhouettes of men on horseback were moving in a steady, deliberate line toward the broken spur. 7 riders, heavily armed. At the center rode Harlon Cole, his silver beard catching the harsh sunlight, a smug, undeniable certainty in his posture. Beside him rode the Pine Ridge Sheriff, a tin star pinned to his chest, bought and paid for with bank money. "They're here," Silas said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, lethal calm. He turned away from the window. He didn't pick up the Winchester. Instead, he looked at the 4 amber jars sitting on the oak table. Clara picked up 2 of the heavy glass spheres by their leather straps. Her hands weren't trembling. She walked over to Silas, her chin tilted up, her dark eyes blazing with a defiant, unyielding fire that rivaled the prairie sun. "Let them come," Clara said. The rhythmic, heavy thud of 28 hooves hitting the hard-packed earth rolled through the yard of the broken spur like a slow-building earthquake. Silas stood just inside the cabin, his shoulder pressed against the heavy pine door frame. Through the crack, he watched Harlon Cole bring his massive roan gelding to a halt just 30 yards from the porch. The 6 men fanning out behind him were a mix of hired guns and the Pine Ridge sheriff, a sweating, nervous man named Dawson who kept wiping his brow with a dirty handkerchief. The heat was oppressive. The silence that followed the settling dust was absolute. "Silas Vance," Cole's voice boomed across the yard, dripping with false mourning and undeniable triumph. "The 30 days are up. Come on out here and save us all the trouble of dragging you out." Silas took a slow, steadying breath. He tied his red cotton bandana loosely around his neck. He looked back at Clara. She stood by the table, a wet linen cloth tied over her nose and mouth, holding the 4 amber jars by their leather straps. Her dark eyes were perfectly calm above the makeshift mask. She nodded once. Silas pushed the door open and stepped out onto the sun-bleached planks of the porch. He didn't bring the Winchester. His hands hung loose and empty at his sides, resting inches from the butt of his holstered Colt. Harlon Cole chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his saddle horn. "I have to admit, Silas, I expected you to be dug in like a tick. But I see you finally found some common sense." "You're trespassing, Cole," Silas said, his voice carrying clear and cold across the yard. Sheriff Dawson spurred his horse a half-step forward, holding up a rolled piece of parchment. "It ain't trespassing, Silas. The bank holds the note. You defaulted on the water rights. I've got the eviction and seizure order right here signed by the county judge. Now you can sign the deed transfer peaceful-like, or we can arrest you for resisting a lawful order." "Lawful," Silas spat the word like poison. "You mean bought and paid for." Cole smiled, his silver beard glinting in the harsh light. "The law is whatever the man with the most money says it is, boy. Now where is that pretty little Boston bride of yours? I hope she packed her silk dresses." It's a long, dusty walk back to town. The cabin door creaked wide open. "I am right here, Mr. Cole," Clara's voice rang out. She stepped onto the porch, pulling the wet linen cloth down to rest around her neck. She didn't look like a defeated aristocrat. She wore her heavy canvas apron, her hands stained with the yellow sap of the broken spur. And dangling from her fingers were 4 thick, wax-sealed amber jars. Cole's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing at the strange glass spheres. "Go back inside, little lady. This is men's business." "This is my home," Clara said, her voice a piercing, unwavering strike of lightning in the heavy air. "And you have terrorized my husband, burned my property, and poisoned my land for the last time." Cole threw his head back and laughed, a cruel barking sound that his hired guns echoed. "And what exactly are you going to do about it? Throw your preserves at us?" "Cole," the sheriff muttered nervously, his horse dancing beneath him. "Let's just get the signature and go." "No," Clara said softly, her dark eyes locking onto the banker. "Let's give you what you came for." She didn't hesitate. Clara swung her arms back and hurled the first 2 amber jars with every ounce of strength she possessed. They didn't aim for the men. They sailed in a high, heavy arc, plummeting directly toward the jagged bedrock outcropping that jutted from the dirt just beneath the front hooves of Cole's massive roan and the sheriff's mount. "What the—" Cole started. Crack! Boom! The impact was deafening. The thick glass shattered against the bedrock, instantly exposing the highly reactive red phosphorus and magnesium shavings to the agonizing friction. A blinding, searing flash of pure white light erupted in the center of the yard, brighter than the Nebraska sun. The explosive oxidation of the saltpeter created a concussive shockwave that rattled the windows of the cabin. But the light and the noise were only the beginning. Instantly, a massive, violently expanding cloud of deep red smoke exploded outward, swallowing Harlon Cole and his men in a thick churning fog of atomized capsicum and wild mustard seed. It was the devil's breath. Total blinding chaos descended on the yard. The horses, terrified by the flash and choking on the caustic air, went completely feral. They reared, bucked, and screamed in panic. Cole's massive roan threw him hard. The banker hit the dirt with a sickening thud, his customized rifle flying from his scabbard. The sheriff's horse bolted sideways, sending Dawson crashing into a water trough. "My eyes! Oh God, my eyes!" one of the hired guns shrieked, dropping his revolver to claw frantically at his face as the burning, searing powder coated his skin and filled his lungs. Silas didn't waste a single heartbeat. He ripped the red bandana up over his nose and mouth, drew his Colt, and plunged straight into the churning red fog. He knew the yard perfectly. The blinded, choking men didn't. A hired gun stumbled out of the smoke, coughing up blood and spit, his hands waving wildly. Silas stepped inside his guard, brought the heavy steel barrel of his Colt down across the man's temple, and dropped him cold. One. He pivoted. Another man was on his knees, dry heaving from the caustic mustard oil, blindly fumbling for a shotgun dropped in the dirt. Silas kicked the weapon away with a heavy boot and planted a right hook flush against the man's jaw. Two. The smoke was thick, burning Silas's eyes even through his squint, the spicy, metallic taste of the powder leaking through his bandana. But the sheer adrenaline-fueled satisfaction of defending his home pushed the pain away. Silas waded deeper into the chaos. He found Sheriff Dawson crawling toward the fence, weeping uncontrollably, snot and tears streaming down his face. Silas grabbed him by the scruff of his collar, hauled him up, and slammed him against the wooden post, disarming him effortlessly. "You're out of your jurisdiction, Dawson," Silas growled, tossing the sheriff aside. Then the smoke shifted. Through the red haze, Harlon Cole was on his hands and knees. The banker was coughing violently, his immaculate broadcloth coat covered in dirt. But his right hand had finally found his silver-plated revolver in the dust. Blinded and enraged, Cole raised the gun, aiming wildly toward the porch where Clara stood. Silas lunged. He didn't shoot. He closed the distance in two massive strides, brought his heavy leather boot down directly onto Cole's wrist, and crushed it against the hard-packed earth. Cole screamed, a high, reedy sound of pure agony, as the silver revolver slipped from his shattered grip. Silas grabbed the banker by the lapels of his coat and hauled him brutally to his feet. Cole's eyes were swollen shut, weeping tears of pure fire, his silver beard stained red with the caustic powder. "You lost, Harlon!" Silas roared over the coughing and the wind. He pressed the cold muzzle of his Colt directly beneath Cole's chin. "You step foot on the broken spur again, and I won't use smoke. Do you understand me?" Cole could only choke and nod, his arrogance completely obliterated by the burning agony in his lungs and the terrifying, violent strength of the man holding him. Suddenly, the heavy sound of an approaching wagon cut through the groans of the defeated men. The wind began to carry the red smoke away, dispersing the caustic cloud over the open prairie. As the air cleared, Silas kept his gun pressed to Cole's throat and looked toward the gate. A heavy supply wagon rumbled into the yard, driven by Eli from the mining camp. Beside the grizzled trader sat a tall, severe-looking man wearing a gray suit and a pristine silver star pinned to his lapel. It wasn't a 10-county badge. It was the star of a United States federal marshal. Silas blinked, lowering his weapon slightly as the marshal climbed down from the wagon, a double-barreled shotgun resting easily in the crook of his arm. Behind him rode 4 armed federal deputies. "Silas Vance?" the marshal asked, surveying the moaning, weeping men scattered across the yard, coughing into their hands. He looked at the shattered glass and the red dust coating the earth, raising an impressed eyebrow. "Looks like we missed a hell of a fight." "Marshal," Silas breathed, stunned. Clara stepped off the porch, pulling her linen mask down. Her eyes were bright, her chest heaving, but a triumphant smile played on her lips. She walked over to stand right beside Silas, her shoulder brushing his arm. "I am Clara Vance," she told the marshal, her voice steady and clear. "I believe you received my letters regarding the poisoning of our water supply and the arson of our property, along with the chemical evidence I sent via the Blackwood trading post." Eli grinned from the wagon seat, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Told you she was a smart one, Silas. Sent that package out 3 weeks ago." The marshal nodded, pulling a sheaf of telegraph papers from his inner pocket. "We did, Mrs. Vance. Your chemical breakdown of the custom phosphorus matches and the arsenic was thorough enough for a federal judge to issue a warrant." He looked down at Harlon Cole in disgust. "Harlon Cole, you are under federal arrest for arson, the poisoning of a water supply, and conspiracy to commit murder. Dawson, you're coming with us too." Cole wheezed, unable to even open his eyes as the federal deputies hauled him and his hired guns to their feet, slapping heavy iron cuffs on their wrists. Silas watched in absolute awe as the greatest threat to his family's legacy was dragged away in chains, weeping like a broken child. He slowly holstered his Colt. The silence returned to the broken spur. But this time, it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of an impending execution. It was the clean, sweeping silence of the open prairie after a violent storm. Silas turned to his wife. Clara was covered in red dust. Her canvas apron was filthy. Her hands were stained, her hair was falling out of its twine, and her eyes were watering slightly from the lingering spice in the air. To Silas, she was the most beautiful, terrifying, magnificent thing he had ever seen. "You wrote the federal marshal," Silas said, a slow, disbelieving laugh rumbling up from his chest. "While I was lying on my stomach covered in honey and willow bark, you were orchestrating a federal sting operation." Clara looked up at him, a wicked, brilliant smile curving her lips. "I told you, Silas, you are a rancher. I am a chemist, and a chemist always prepares for a reaction." Silas didn't care about the lingering sting of the pepper in the air or the federal deputies watching them. He reached out, wrapped his massive arms around her waist, and lifted her clean off the ground. He spun her around, burying his face in her neck, laughing, a deep, booming, joyous sound that echoed off the canyon walls and rolled across the endless sea of Nebraska grass. They had won. Against all odds, the fire, the poison, and the bank, they had held the line. And they had done it together. 1 year later, the Nebraska wind no longer carried the scent of dry dust and impending ruin. As it swept down the valley and rolled across the broken spur, it carried the sharp, sweet fragrance of blooming echinacea, wild mint, and the rich, damp loam of cultivated earth. Silas Vance stood on the porch of the expanded cabin, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm. He watched a heavy freight wagon rumble out of the yard, the driver tipping his hat. The wagon bed was loaded high with sturdy wooden crates branded with a new iron mark, Vance Botanical Provisions. They were bound for the railhead, destined for mining camps, military forts, and apothecaries as far west as California. The ranch was unrecognizable from the dying, desolate stretch of scrub brush it had been a year ago. Where the burned storage barn had once stood, 2 massive, well-ventilated drying sheds now stretched toward the creek. In the pastures where Silas had once watched his cattle drop from the plague, neat irrigated rows of medicinal roots and herbs flourished under the relentless sun. They still kept a small, healthy herd of longhorns, but the true wealth of the broken spur lay in the soil, coaxed to life by the brilliant mind of a Boston exile and the unbreakable back of a Nebraska cowboy. Harlon Cole was sitting in a federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, his empire dismantled, his bank seized by the territory. The water of the creek flowed free, clear, and untainted. Silas stepped off the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He ignored the bustling ranch hands and the clatter of the new blacksmith forge. His gray eyes scanned the horizon, searching for a familiar flash of canvas and dark hair. He found her exactly where he knew she would be. Silas climbed the gentle slope toward the eastern ridge, the buffalo grass parting against his denim trousers. As he neared the jagged lip of the Devil's Cut, the sheer limestone drop-off where they had fought their very first battle over a single stubborn root, he slowed his pace. Clara stood at the very edge of the precipice, looking out over the sprawling green valley. She wore a sturdy canvas skirt and one of his old chambray shirts, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her dark hair was woven into a thick, practical braid that hung down her back, but her silhouette had changed dramatically from the slender, fragile-looking aristocrat who had stepped off the bullet-riddled stagecoach. Silas walked up behind her, his footsteps silent on the soft earth. He didn't speak. He simply stepped close, wrapping his massive, scarred arms around her from behind, and pulled her back flush against his chest. Clara let out a soft, contented sigh, leaning her weight into his solid warmth. Silas crossed his forearms over her stomach, his large hands resting gently, reverently over the pronounced, unmistakable swell of her pregnant belly. Beneath his calloused palms, he felt the sudden, distinct flutter of a kick. A slow, brilliant smile broke across Silas's weathered face. "He's restless today." "She," Clara corrected playfully, resting her hands over his. "And she has every right to be. I've been on my feet since dawn cataloging the new willow bark yield." Silas lowered his head, pressing a kiss to the curve of her neck, inhaling the intoxicating, familiar scent of wild sage and sweet honey that always clung to her skin. "I told you to let the hands do the cataloging, Clara. You're supposed to be resting." "I am pregnant, Silas, not made of spun glass," she murmured, turning her head slightly to catch his lips in a brief, tender kiss. "Besides, no one knows how to grade the alkaloid concentrations like I do. Not yet, anyway." Silas chuckled, a deep rumbling sound that vibrated against her back. He looked down at her hands resting over his. They were still the hands of a worker. The yellow-brown stains of plant resin and chemical distillations were permanently worked into the creases of her skin. Her knuckles bore tiny, faded white scars from thorns and sharp rocks, but catching the golden light of the late afternoon sun, gleaming against the stains and the scars, was a heavy, polished gold wedding band. Silas had bought it in Omaha 6 months ago, replacing the scuffed silver ring from their rushed, desperate wedding in Pine Ridge. It was a symbol of a vow that had been tested by fire, poison, and blood, and had come out utterly unbreakable. "I received a letter from Boston yesterday," Clara said quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Silas went perfectly still, the protective instinct instantly flaring in his chest. "From the creditors?" "No. From a law firm," Clara replied, her thumb tracing the scarred knuckle of his index finger. "The man who framed my father was caught embezzling from his new partners. To save himself from the gallows, he confessed to everything. My father's name has been officially cleared in the scientific journals. They reinstated his legacy." Silas let out a slow, heavy breath, resting his chin on the top of her head. "I'm glad, Clara. Truly, he deserved that." He hesitated, the shadow of an old fear creeping into the edge of his voice. Did they offer you your place back in society?" Clara turned in his arms. She looked up at him, seeing the raw vulnerability in his gray eyes, the lingering irrational fear that one day this brilliant, extraordinary woman would realize she belonged in a grand parlor instead of a prairie cabin. She reached up, her stained, beautiful hands framing his rugged, stubble-darkened face. "They offered to restore my family's estate," Clara said softly, her dark eyes locking onto his with absolute burning certainty. They invited me to return to Boston, to take my place among the people who once threw me to the wolves. "And what did you tell them?" Silas whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. Clara smiled, a fierce, radiant, breathtaking smile that eclipsed the Nebraska sunset. "I told them to lose my address," she breathed, rising up on her toes to press her forehead against his. "I told them I was already home." Silas let out a ragged, joyous breath. He crushed his mouth to hers, kissing her with all the fierce, overwhelming devotion that consumed his soul. Clara kissed him back, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, the cool evening wind whipping around them, carrying the scent of the harvest. When they finally broke apart, breathless and smiling, Silas turned her gently back toward the valley, keeping his arms securely around her waist, his hands resting once again over the child growing within her. Below them, the broken spur glowed in the amber light of dusk. It was a monument to two fathers, one who had broken his back trying to tame the earth, and one who had broken his mind trying to understand it. But more than that, it was a testament to the man and woman standing on the cliff's edge. They had taken the ashes of their pasts and forged an empire. Silas looked out over his land, feeling the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of his wife against his chest, and the undeniable, fluttering life of his child beneath his hands. The storms would come again, the winters would be cruel, and the frontier would always demand its pound of flesh. But Silas Vance was no longer afraid. He held Clara tighter as the sun finally dipped below the jagged western peaks, painting the endless Nebraska sky in strokes of violent purple and brilliant gold. They had not just survived the fire. Their roots had gone too deep to ever be pulled up again. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.